Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local and Family History Lecture Series. As part of our program, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our buildings and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massasoit people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect, found in our motto, free to all. Tonight, we are very pleased to have David J. Silverman here to talk about his book, This Land is Their Land, The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving, on the upcoming 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving. David J. Silverman is professor at George Washington University, where he specializes in Native American, colonial American, and American racial history. He is the author of Thundersticks, Red Brethren, Ninegret, and Faith and Boundaries. His essays have won major awards from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture and the New York Academy of History. He lives in Philadelphia. This program is being recorded. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture, but can be written in the Q&A box at any time. Thanks for coming and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Diane. And can you hear me okay? Great. I'm delighted to see all of you out here on a night where I know the Patriots are playing later. So I promise you that we'll end on time for all of you to catch the game and for me to catch the game. I'm delighted to speak here at the invitation of the BPL. I've been doing manuscript research throughout my career in the BPL's special collections. And off and on, I've enjoyed spending time reading and researching in the beautiful reading room of the Copley Square location. So it's a treat to be here with all of you tonight. Before I turn to the heart of this talk, I'd like to offer some preliminary remarks. Some members of this audience might find it jarring to see the word Indians in my title and to hear me use it during this appearance tonight. So let me explain why I made that deliberate choice. We all know that Indians is a misnomer propagated by Europeans because, after all, we're not in India, or I'm assuming that most of you are not. It's hard to know given this kind of format. Now, in recent decades, of course, some people have substituted the term Native Americans for Indians in an effort to be more accurate and racially sensitive. And yet, in the course of my many years of interacting with Indigenous people all across the United States, I've learned that most of them, certainly not all of them, but most, favor the term Indian when referring to them in the aggregate. Though almost to a person, they prefer tribal names when appropriate. I am learning, though. I had a dinner this past week with a Mashpee Wampanoag colleague and graduate of my university who currently researches at the Brookings Institution, who told me of two recent surveys that suggested that this opinion in Indian country is beginning to shift, that a preference for the term Native American is rising. So I might very well change my terminology in my next book. The point is, though, that my use of the term Indian tonight is out of deference to my Indigenous friends and colleagues, not indifference. I also want to emphasize here that though my book focuses on historic Wampanoag people and strives to include their voices at every turn, let's be clear here, I'm not Wampanoag, and this is decidedly not a history told from a modern Wampanoag perspective. Now, to be sure, my conversations with modern Wampanoag people have informed the content. Indeed, those conversations inspired this book in the first place. But there's material in my book and in my talk that some Wampanoag people will consider dubious, outright wrong, and even none of my business as an outsider. I did my best to weigh those criticisms in advance by soliciting responses to drafts of this book from historically minded Wampanoag colleagues and friends, and discussing my ideas with Wampanoag audiences open to hearing them. Along the way, I offered to include dissenting opinions alongside my own interpretations, all the while acknowledging that the playing field is uneven because, after all, I'm the author. So ultimately, all the editorial decisions in my book and in this talk tonight belong to me alone. And in the final analysis, I've made a number of tough choices based on the standards of my discipline of history. So given that, I want to urge all of you here tonight to seek out the Wampanoag's own tellings of this history. They're widely available. It just takes a Google search in print, film, online, media, what have you. And my endnotes cite a number of those sources. My hope is that Wampanoags and other Indigenous readers and audience members here tonight will see an informed, well-intentioned attempt to fulfill the Indian call to take Indian history seriously within the context of a greater American history. And so with that, for generations, Americans have been telling themselves a patriotic story of the supposed first Thanksgiving that treats colonization as a consensual, bloodless affair. In this tale, you're all familiar with it, the Pilgrims, religious dissenters from England, cram aboard the Mayflower to brave the stormy Atlantic and seek freedom of conscience in America. Just bear with me for a moment while I try to get my slides together here. There we go. Now, these sea-tossed adventurers land off Cape Cod with a fresh copy of their proto-constitution, the Mayflower Compact, and after some fruitless exploring and brief confrontations with the natives, decide to found their settlement up the coast at a place they call Plymouth. Yet the future of the colony is very much in doubt during its first couple of months, because the Indians, rarely identified by tribe in traditional tellings, on whom the English know they must depend for food and protection, seem to be at best wary and shy, and at worst, hostile. However, eventually the natives reach out to the newcomers through the interpreters Samoset and Squanto. The traditional story sidesteps the obvious question of how these figures managed to learn English, nor does it explain why the natives suddenly became so friendly. The natives' chief, Ousamequin, who the English know by his title, Massasoit, even agrees to a treaty of alliance with Plymouth. Over the spring and the summer, the Indians feed the Pilgrims, teach them how to plant corn and where to fish, whereupon the colony begins to thrive. That fall, the two parties seal their friendship with the famous First Thanksgiving. The peace that follows, the telling goes, permits colonial New England, and by extension, modern America, to become blessed seats of freedom, democracy, Christianity, and plenty. As for what happens to the Indians next, this story has nothing to say. The Indians' legacy is to present America as a gift to white people, or in other words, to concede to colonialism. Like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, two of the other famous Indians of early American history, they help the colonizers and then move off stage. The Wampanoags, who are the Indians in this drama, have long contended that this tale is not history, but a myth that sugarcoats the viciousness of colonialism for Indigenous people. My book reckons with this uncomfortable assertion and its implications. For instance, in traditional accounts of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims step onto Plymouth Rock and into a new world or wilderness, when in fact, human civilizations in the Americas were every bit as rich and ancient as in Europe or anywhere else on the face of the globe. History did not begin for the Wampanoags with the arrival of the Mayflower. They already had a dynamic past, countless generations old, that shaped who they were and what they did. In other words, they inhabited an old world. And the so-called wilderness in which the English arrived was full of villages, roads, cornfields, historic monuments, cemeteries, and forests cleared of underbrush through controlled burns, all by native design. You can get a sense of what I'm talking about here in this drawing of the Wampanoag community of Patuxet on the very site that the English would found Plymouth. And this drawing was created by the French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1605, 15 years before the Pilgrim arrival. It's not only the Wampanoag's ancient history that mattered, their recent history mattered too. Though the Thanksgiving myth implies that the Pilgrim Wampanoag encounter was a first contact episode, in fact, it was just one in a string of bloody meetings between the Wampanoags and Europeans since 1524, and particularly from 1602 onward, as yet another drawing by Champlain captures. And historians like me are quite grateful to Samuel de Champlain. The Thanksgiving myth portrays the Wampanoags as timid and overawed by the Pilgrims. But I showed that the Wampanoags were easily the stronger party during Plymouth's early years. The English did not dictate to the Wampanoags. Instead, the Wampanoags initially used Plymouth colony as a pawn in their domestic and intertribal politics. I think it will come as a surprise to many of you that the celebrated first Thanksgiving feast actually played a minor role in this relationship. Far more influential in shaping the alliance were a series of other, less palatable episodes, filled with violence and power politics. I also submit that our emphasis on the nearly 50 years of formal peace following the so-called First Thanksgiving and its associated treaty of 1621 elides the far more important point that the Wampanoags came to resent the colonists' aggressive and often underhanded expansion. The truth is that the English and the Wampanoags nearly came to blows repeatedly during that supposed long peace, and particularly after the death of Ousamequin in 1660, culminating in the terrible King Philip's War of 1675 and 76. Most histories that bother to include the Wampanoags end with this war. But my book contends that accounting with the Thanksgiving myth as a white lie requires tracing Wampanoag struggles with colonialism all the way through the centuries, right up to the present day. And I think this perspective is especially urgent at a time when modern America is grappling with new manifestations of white nationalism, while at the very same time, Indigenous Americans in New England and all across the country are reasserting their political, economic, and cultural sovereignty, their self-determination, in other words. We need long-term historical perspectives to understand these dual developments. So to explore these themes and bring Wampanoag voices to the foreground, I'm going to focus this talk around three cases spread across the centuries in which Wampanoags and other Native people closely affiliated with them posed counter narratives to white people's triumphalist histories. And our first revisionist historian is none other than the Wampanoag sachem, or chief, Plymouth, better known to history as King Philip. In the late spring of 1675, more than 50 years after his father Ousamequin or Massasoit had greeted the Pilgrims, Plymouth sat down to talk with a delegation of English magistrates from the colony of Rhode Island. To give you a sense of where this action took place, here's a map of Wampanoag country. And this was the location of this conference. Now, the Rhode Islanders were there to encourage the sachem to agree to a peaceful arbitration of the Wampanoag's mounting tensions with Plymouth colony. Yet Plymouth had already decided to fight and agreed to this talk simply to explain why. So let's take a moment and consider what he had to say that day. And by the way, the fact that this conversation is recorded, the fact that Pometicom's criticisms of English colonialism made their way into the written record in such clear form is a boon to historians like me. Documents like this are quite rare. By the way, the lieutenant governor of Rhode Island, who made the record of this conversation, I strongly believe spoke the Wampanoag language. So this is probably a conversation in Wampanoag that the lieutenant governor of Rhode Island was then translating into English. Pometicom said he viewed the history of Wampanoag-English relations as little more than the colonists' failure to live up to the 1621 alliance. The sachem recalled that when the Pilgrims first settled at Plymouth 55 years earlier, his father, Ousamequin, and I quote here, was as a great man, and the English as a little child. Pometicom contended that Ousamequin, whose mark you see here, could have wiped out the infant colony if he had wished. Instead, he held back its native enemies, and there were lots of them. He fed the starving colonists and granted them ample tracts of land. Now, Pometicom's memory was selective here. He conveniently left out that his father had made this choice less out of altruism or friendliness, as the Thanksgiving myth would have it, than a need for allies. For the Wampanoags had been hobbled by a plague between the years 1616 and 1619, almost certainly inadvertently introduced to them by a European explorer. And as their population plummeted, the Narragansetts to the west, who didn't contract the disease, began subjugating them. Pometicom also overlooked his father's desire to become the point man in trade with the English in order to consolidate his authority over the loose Wampanoag polity. But generally, Pometicom was correct that Plymouth would have become yet another in a string of English lost colonies if it hadn't been for Wampanoag largesse. And how did Plymouth show its gratitude? Decades later, now that it had become the great man and the Wampanoags the little child. Pometicom, and you see his mark here, cited the example that in 1662, Plymouth had seized and, he alleged, fatally poisoned his brother, Wamsutta, who the English called Alexander, because the English feared, and I think they were right, that he was plotting an anti-colonial league. More recently, the English had used Christian Indian testimony to arrest, try, and execute 3 of Pometicom's men for the supposed murder of another Christian Indian, John Sachem, who had been leaking Wampanoag intelligence to colonial authorities. To Pometicom, Plymouth Colony's executions of the accused Sachem murderers and its presumed assassination of Wamsutta were bad enough as discrete events. But worse still, they crystallized a vast array of English wrongs. Pometicom denounced that in English courts, and I quote again, if 20 honest Indians testified that an Englishman had done them wrong, it was as nothing. But if one of the worst Indians testified against any Indian suspected by the English, that was sufficient. Furthermore, the English had begun to interfere in criminal matters between Wampanoags within Wampanoag territory. Pometicom railed that, and I quote again, whatever was only between Indians and not in English townships, they would not have us prosecute. About half of the Wampanoags, mostly on Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, had adopted Christianity and sworn off Pometicom's leadership, as well as the responsibility to pay him tribute, fearing no reprisal from the sachem because they enjoyed English protection by virtue of their Christianity. If all this wasn't enough, there were still other issues. The English used land deeds, some fair, some foul, to claim Wampanoag territory for their own exclusive use under their own exclusive jurisdiction. Well, This pattern ran contrary to the natives' expectation that their land sales merely conveyed permission for the English to settle among them under their own customs, or in other words, for the English to become part of Wampanoag society. When native people resisted, colonists flooded the contested tracts with livestock and slapped any Indians who injured the animals, these four-legged trespassers, with trumped-up criminal fines and lawsuits. The point was to force holdout natives to release their claims and resign themselves to the English interpretation of these sales. Machinations of this sort gave the colonists, as Pametacom put it, and I quote, 100 times more land now than the king, meaning Pametacom himself, had for his people. To the Wampanoags then, English law was but a shakedown by people with short memories and thin loyalty. Given these patterns, Pametacom asked rhetorically, why would he put any faith in the negotiated settlement proposed by Rhode Island? History taught that the English would just use some technical violation as an excuse to confiscate his land and even to murder him. The Rhode Islanders, seeing where this conversation was headed, cautioned Pametacom that it would be suicidal for the Wampanoags to resort to arms, because they said the English were too strong for them. Well, in that case, the sachem retorted, and I quote, then the English should do to them, the Wampanoags, as they did when they were too strong for the English. In other words, he called on colonists to assume the role of the great man by acting with generosity, restraint, and justice toward the Wampanoag little child. And that's where this conference ended, because everyone knew this wish was futile. Just days later, Pametacom led a Wampanoag force against nearby English towns, prompting a war that would engulf the entire region and ultimately break the back of indigenous power in southern New England. This horrific war is the most basic feature of the Wampanoag-English relationship that the Thanksgiving myth studiously ignores. Initially, Wampanoag resistance fighters got the best of it by repeatedly sacking exposed English townships and ambushing troops on the march. Furthermore, soon they had the support of the Nipmucks, the Narragansetts, and the Pecumtucks and Secokis, who the colonists turned into enemies by violating their neutrality, such as attempting to confiscate their arms or forcing them to turn over Wampanoag women and children who sought refuge with them. The English made things even worse for themselves by treating the thousands of Christian Indians who pledged fealty to the colonies as wolves in sheep's clothing. Massachusetts and Plymouth herded the Christian Indians into island concentration camps, including one on Deer Island in Boston Harbor, where the people suffered malnutrition and exposure. The warring Indians took advantage of these colonial missteps to accumulate victories in which they took the lives of upwards of 3,000 Englishmen, destroyed 16 colonial towns, and slaughtered 800 head of cattle. Eventually, however, the resistance collapsed, in no small degree because other native people threw in their lot with the English, which is one of the very difficult aspects of colonial native relations to grapple with. Here, I'd like you to focus your attention to this part of the map here, just to the east of the Hudson River along the modern day border of Massachusetts and New York. In February of 1676, the Mohawks, the easternmost nation of the Haudenosaunee, or Five Nations Iroquois, as a gesture of alliance to the young English colony of New York, drove Pametacom's winter camp away from Dutch and French gun markets on the Hudson and eastward back into the teeth of colonial New England forces. Also lying in wait were the Mohegans and Pequots of what's now Connecticut, and Christian Wampanoags from Cape Cod, who, under duress to be certain, had sided with the colonies from the beginning and were just as adept at forest warfare as the resistance fighters. Meanwhile, the warring Indians and their families were stalked by hunger and disease as they lived in cramped quarters, on the run, away from their cornfields, away from their fishing stations. Consequently, by the late spring and early summer of 1676, growing numbers of them began to accept a late English offer of quarter in exchange for switching sides. Others managed to avoid this terrible fate by escaping to the upper Hudson River Valley or Canada, where they built new lives. But most of them never made it that far. By June 1676, Native prisoners were telling their English captors that Plymouth, and I quote here, was ready to die, for you have now killed or taken all his relations, and almost broke his heart. Those relations included his wife, Watunakunuski, and their son, we don't know his name, who colonists captured and sold into the horrors of Caribbean slavery. They were but two of the estimated 2,000 Indians, men, women, and children alike, who the English sentenced to slavery, and not only in New England, but as far away as the West Indies, Gibraltar, and Tangier. Some of these poor souls had surrendered based on English promises of mercy, only to discover that the terms were harsher than colonial authorities had led them to believe. Worse still, some surrendering Indians learned too late that colonial officials would not spare any native person they suspected of having taken an English life. Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Rhode Island held public executions throughout the summer and early fall of 1676, including 50 hangings on Boston Common alone, an event which the Common, to my knowledge, has yet to acknowledge. The English even exacted retribution on the dead. On August 6th, colonial forces discovered the drowned body of Weetamoo, a female sachem, war leader, and the sister of Plymouth's wife. Authorities ordered her head to be severed and piked next to a holding pen full of Wampanoag prisoners. The captives, according to an English account, made a most horrid and diabolical lamentation, crying out, "It was their queen's head." A few days after this incident, Plymouth was dead too, shot down by a Christian Indian who the English called Alderman. Filled with a vengeful spirit, Benjamin Church, captain in Plymouth's army, had the sachem dismembered and his head sent to Plymouth. There, on the very site where the sachem's father had allied and feasted with the pilgrims in what we now call the first Thanksgiving, authorities mounted their grisly trophy outside the town gate and left it there to rot for the next 20 years. It might have been one of the last things that Plymouth's wife saw when Plymouth shipped her from her homeland into slavery. Later that week, Plymouth held a day of Thanksgiving in praise of God for saving the colony from its enemies. I think we can all agree these horrors are as contrary to the traditional Thanksgiving story as it gets. Though history rarely pays attention to the Wampanoags after King Philip's War, my book emphasizes that this conflict was just the first stage in a centuries-long battle to defend their land and sovereignty. It should come as no surprise to anyone on this call that the English seized nearly all of the Wampanoag's territory in the decades after the war, leaving only a handful of town-sized reservations for mostly Christian Indians. Please note here that I didn't frame this process as the Wampanoags losing their land as if by mistake. Let's be clear, colonists and their successors took it. The English also seized the Wampanoags as bound laborers. From the late 1600s through the mid-1800s, white merchant creditors, courts, and government-appointed guardians colluded to force the Wampanoags and their children into indentured servitude to white farmers, householders, and whaling merchants. And the terms of this servitude often lasted for several years, and in some cases, even decades. Such debt peonage and court-ordered servitude, one of my colleagues calls it judicial slavery, made it nearly impossible for the Wampanoags to maintain their normal social patterns, including the process of raising their children, to the point that few Wampanoags could speak their ancestral language by the mid-1800s. Enter William Apis, the Pequot-born preacher to the Mashpee Wampanoags of Cape Cod, who will be our second native figure after Pometacom to dispute white Americans' self-serving, sanitized histories. In 1836, right in the middle of Jacksonian Indian removal, Apis wrote his eulogy on King Philip, which used a revisionist account of the Pilgrim Saga to call attention to the plight of indigenous people. In it, Apis argued that Indians were the real heroes of Plymouth's founding because they comported themselves like real Christians, whereas the supposedly saintly pilgrims behaved like villains and hypocrites. Apis meticulously laid out how the pilgrims had introduced themselves to the Wampanoags by desecrating their graves and looting their corn, then had the audacity to turn to Ousamequin for help. Yet the chief, to his moral credit, obliged, like a true Christian, imbued with the principles of charity and forgiveness. No people could be used better than they were, Apis intoned. The Wampanoags gave the English venison and sold them many hogsheads of corn. Had it not been for this humane act of the Indians, every white man would have been swept from the New England colonies. Apis also contended that Massasoit's son, Pometacom, was, and I quote, the greatest man that ever lived upon American shores. Apis ranked him even higher than my university's namesake, George Washington, because the sachem fought against a darker tyranny and for greater freedom with far fewer means at his disposal. In Apis's telling, Pometacom was no misguided hothead for taking up arms against colonial dominance. Rather, he was a sage, because he foresaw, and I quote, that the white people would not only cut down their groves, but would enslave them. And how true the prophecy. Our groves and hunting grounds are gone. Our dead are dug up. Our council fires are put out. It was all an outgrowth, Apis submitted, of a fire, a canker, created by the pilgrims from across the Atlantic to burn and destroy my poor unfortunate brethren. And by the way, he delivered this oration in Boston in front of a white audience. In light of this sordid history, Apis proposed that Indians should treat each December 22nd, the anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing in Plymouth, and every 4th of July as, and I quote, days of mourning and not joy. Let them rather fast and pray to the Great Spirit, the Indians' God, who deals out mercy to his red children and not destruction. This call by Apis for Native people to commemorate that they bore the burden of white America's triumphs would continue to resonate with the Wampanoags and eventually other Native people long after he was gone. Less than 40 years later, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts addressed the stubborn refusal of the Wampanoags to disappear by dissolving their reservations of Mashpee, Herring Pond, Gayhead, Chappaquiddick, Christiantown, and still others. The state divided the common lands of these places into private property tracts, subjected those lands to taxation and confiscation for debt, and declared the inhabitants to be full-fledged citizens and no longer Indians, as if those two things were antithetical. white officials congratulated themselves that in their magnanimity, they had bestowed legal equality on Indians, just as New Englanders were pressuring white Southerners to do with Black freedmen and women under Reconstruction. They refused to listen to the Wampanoags, who protested that this supposed gift of citizenship was actually a Trojan horse to rob them of their remaining land and force them to scatter. And that was indeed the point. White proponents of this measure, at their more honest moments, admitted that they considered the Wampanoags to be too racially intermixed to be classified as Indians any longer, and that in any case, it was the fate, the manifest destiny, of Indians to vanish. Over the next century, white Americans did everything they could to make that supposedly natural process occur, including reducing Indians to romantic bit parts in the country's history, as exemplified in the Thanksgiving myth. Now, let me emphasize here, throughout the colonial era, throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and well into the 1800s, Thanksgiving had no association whatsoever with pilgrims and Indians. The link between the holiday and this supposed history appears to date to 1841, when the Reverend Alexander Young published a primary source account of a 1621 harvest feast hosted by Plymouth Colony and attended by the neighboring Wampanoags. To it, and here's the account right here. By the way, notice how short the primary source account of this Thanksgiving was. It really is a non-event. So, to this account of the feast, Young added an influential footnote, which you see right here. And by the way, trust me, as a historian, there aren't a lot of influential footnotes out there. This is one of them. And it read, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England." Well, over the next 50 years, various Yankee artists, authors, lecturers, politicians, and the like disseminated Young's idea until Americans took it for granted. I could only wish that my own footnotes were so influential. Now, predictably, New Englanders were the first to tout the Pilgrims as national founders and their dinner with Indians as a template for Thanksgiving. But for the rest of the country to go along, the nation first had to subjugate the tribes of the Great Plains and Far West, because only then could white people stop vilifying Indians as bloodthirsty savages and give them an unthreatening role in a national founding myth. The Pilgrim Saga also took hold because it had use in the nation's culture wars. It was no coincidence that the Pilgrims emerged as founding fathers amid popular anxiety that the United States was being overrun by immigrants, Catholics, mostly from Ireland and Germany, who were supposedly unappreciative of the country's Protestant democratic origins and values. The Thanksgiving myth would teach them that appreciation. Additionally, treating the Pilgrims as the epitome of colonial America served to minimize the country's record of racial oppression, past and present. Better to highlight the Pilgrims' religious and democratic principles instead of the Indian wars and slavery more typical of colonies, including of Plymouth. Through such means, Northeasterners could define the so-called Black and Indian problems as Southern and Western exceptions to an otherwise inspiring national heritage. So what I'm saying here is that though Americans eventually assumed that the Thanksgiving holiday had been associated with Pilgrims and Indians since 1621, that wasn't the case. The tradition was a 19th century product of white Protestants, particularly Yankees, asserting their cultural authority over European immigrants, Americans of color, and other regions of the United States. We might call it revisionist history. This invention became tradition by the early 20th century and it has remained so, in no small part through American schools holding annual Thanksgiving pageants in which students dress up as pilgrims and Indians to reenact the first Thanksgiving. I myself remember participating in one such performance. If memory serves, I was cast as a tree, which ended my acting career before it began. But I do remember we sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee," praising America as a sweet land of liberty and the Pilgrims as my fathers. The point of this exercise was to have a diverse group of school children learn about who we as Americans are, or at least who we're supposed to be. Even students from ethnic backgrounds would be instilled with the principles of representative government, liberty, and Christianity, while learning to identify with English colonists as fellow white people. Leaving Indians outside the category of my fathers also carried important lessons. It was yet another reminder about which race ran the country and whose values mattered. This is why we need to learn about how race is invented. Lest we dismiss the impact of these messages, let's consider the experience of a young Wampanoag woman who told me that when she was in grade school, the lone Indian in her class, her teacher cast her as Chief Massasoit in one of these pageants and then had her sing, "This land is your land. This land is my land." Now, at the time, she was just embarrassed. But now, as an adult, she sees the cruel irony in it. Other Wampanoags tell me about their parents objecting to these pageants and almost invariably to associated history lessons that the New England Indians were all gone, only to have school officials question the parents' and the children's claim to be Indian. Authentic Indians were supposed to be primitive relics, not modern people. So what were they doing in school? Speaking English, wearing contemporary clothing, and returning home to adults who had jobs and drove cars. By 1970, Frank James, the third in our sequence of Native revisionist historians, had reached the limits of his patience with this nonsense. James was born and raised in the community of Aquina, or Gayhead on Martha's Vineyard, which had long ranked as one of the poorest communities in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, James grew up determined to succeed and represent his people. As a teenager, he even adopted the Wampanoag name Wamsutta, after the eldest son of Ousamequin, who preceded Pametacom in calling on the Wampanoags to resist colonialism. James's inner drive carried him all the way to the New England Conservatory, where he studied trumpet, and then to the Nauset Regional Schools on Cape Cod, where he became director of music. Yet his passion was political activism and the study of Wampanoag history, for he understood that knowing the past is critical to reforming the present. And what he read when he went to the primary sources made his blood boil, because it bore little relation to the Thanksgiving myth that weighed around his people's neck like a millstone. So when James was invited to speak at a state banquet celebrating the 350th anniversary of Plymouth's founding, he saw it as a rare opportunity to set the record straight. Yet when he submitted a draft of his speech for review, white officials rejected it as too inflammatory. James, for his part, found an alternative script drawn up by the state to be so childish and untrue, as he put it, that he pulled out of the event altogether, and instead drew up plans for a commemoration where there would be no censors. Inspired by the era's Red Power movement for Indigenous rights and justice, James organized what he called a National Day of Mourning to be held on Thanksgiving Day, 1970, at the site of the Massasoit statue overlooking Plymouth Rock. In choosing this name for the event, James hearkened not only to national days of mourning held after the assassinations of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He also reached all the way back to Apus's eulogy on King Philip. And like Apus incarnate, when James's moment came, he rose up before protesters from all across Indian country, media, and onlookers, and delivered the inflammatory speech that Massachusetts had tried to suppress. He began with the poignant assertion that he had the right to the dignity of his humanity, despite society's efforts to diminish him and his people. I speak to you as a man, he stressed, a Wampanoag man. I am a proud man, proud of my ancestry, my accomplishments, won by strict parental direction. Despite his family and his community suffering what he called poverty and discrimination, two social and economic diseases. He acknowledged to his white listeners that Thanksgiving, and I quote, is a time of celebration for you, celebrating the beginnings of the white man in America. For James and his fellow Wampanoags, however, the day had doleful implications. It is with a heavy heart, he explained, that I look back on what happened to my people. Like Apus, more than a century earlier, James proceeded to tell a history of English Wampanoag relations that transformed the bedtime story of the Thanksgiving myth into a nightmare. His conclusion was that Ousamequin's welcome of the Pilgrims, and I quote, was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoags, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. To James, like Pometicom, like Apus, the moral of the first Thanksgiving was that the English and their white successors had betrayed the Wampanoags who befriended them in their time of need. And this is the message that is echoed through subsequent national days of mourning, which the United American Indians of New England have continued to hold each Thanksgiving right up to this very day. The question for all of us was and is how to move forward. James's answer is to confront this history, including the fact, as he put it, that the Wampanoag still walk the lands of Massachusetts. James also urged his fellow Americans to consider Indians as worthy of the same respect as everyone else. Let us remember, he counseled, the Indian is and was as human as the white man. The Indian feels pain, gets hurt, and becomes defensive, has dreams, bears tragedy and failure, suffers from loneliness, needs to cry as well as laugh. If the American people followed his counsel to extend their native countrymen and women basic compassion and acknowledgement, it would make Thanksgiving Day 1970 a new beginning toward what James called a more humane America, a more Indian America, in which Native people could, and I quote again, regain the position in this country that is rightfully ours. I submit that there were so many reasons for Americans to follow James's lead and attempt to tell the history of Plymouth and Thanksgiving with three-dimensional Wampanoag actors at the center. Thanksgiving eclipses Columbus Day as a focal point for considering the Native American past. It's bad enough to have gotten the story so wrong for so long. I think it's downright inexcusable to continue the annual tradition of having teachers, politicians, and television producers traffic in the Thanksgiving myth, and residential homes and shopping centers sport decorations of happy pilgrims and Indians. These practices dismiss Native people's very real historical traumas at white hands in favor of depicting their ancestors as consenting to colonialism. To call the consequences of this lie harmless is to ignore the chorus of Native Americans, our fellow Americans, who say the hurt is profound, particularly to their children. And this population, I'm sure we can all agree, has already suffered far more than its fair share in the creation of the United States. I must add that Indigenous people have also contributed disproportionately to the military in every single one of the nation's wars from the very beginning. In a pluralistic country, it's morally unacceptable to allow the celebration of a national holiday to damage part of the nation's people. Never mind the first people, or for that matter, all of the people. Whereas the identity politics of marginalized groups tends to focus on achieving justice and equality, or in the Native case, sovereignty as well, white identity politics has always centered on oppressing others. Yet there's been far too little public reflection about how the Thanksgiving myth teaches white proprietorship of the nation. Tell me why a school-age child with the name of, say, Silverman should identify more with the Pilgrims than the Indians. After all, such a student is unlikely to descend from either group, and the descendants of both groups are Silverman's fellow Americans. If the student is taught to think more dispassionately of both the Pilgrims and Indians as they instead of we, which is how historians approach such things, maybe it would be a step toward a more critical understanding of history in which all of the actors can be seen as fully human, with the virtues and shortcomings that one would expect to see in any population. At the same time, if the student is taught to think of both groups more inclusively as we, acutely conscious of the associated risk of appropriation, it might be a step toward a more compassionate national culture. This vision would have school curriculums treat Native American history as basic to an understanding of American history, as it should be. Such lessons would address the civilizations Indigenous people created over thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, the ways they have suffered under and resisted colonialism, and how they have passed through the apocalypse of centuries and managed to survive and adapt to modern life while maintaining their distinct identities and defending their Indigenous rights. Units on American government would address the sovereignty of Indian tribes as a basic feature of American federalism, something that almost never happens. Such a shift might also feature bringing Native people and their concerns into the national conversation, including having presidential candidates, as a matter of course, hold serious discussions about their Indian policies in the state of Indian country. The only time I've ever seen it is in the last Democratic primary and in no other political context. If the public continues to associate Pilgrim Indian relations with Thanksgiving, and I don't think we have to, but if we're going to, the least we can do is get the story straight, with Wampanoag actors and perspectives at the center. Imagine if instead of trafficking in the mythical Thanksgiving, we as a country reckoned with the story as told by Pometicom, William Apis, and Frank James. Now, I'm not naive. I realize the challenges are significant at many levels. Many Americans are uncomfortable with the Native American past, or the past of any racial others. Such a perspective tends to turn patriotic episodes inside out and heroes into villains, or at least into deeply flawed heroes. Such a perspective loosens white claims on morality and authority. Such a perspective raises political and cultural questions about justice. It threatens to tear down monuments and rename buildings. But confronting this darkness also promises to shed light, cultivate national humility, and most importantly, I think, signal to Indigenous people that the country values them as us. As one gracious Aquinnah Wampanoag elder once told me, we do ourselves no good by hiding from the truth. And I think she was talking about all of us. Amen. And I welcome your questions and comments.
There are some questions in the box here.
Let's see what we have here. Just wondering when the presentation is going to start. That one's easy. What about Pokanoket being the historical name for the peoples you refer to in relation to Plymouth Colony? Right. So there is a band self-identifying as the Pokanokets today who are contending that the name Wampanoag is an anachronism, that Wampanoags in the 17th century should be called the Pokanokets. I think the jury is out on that claim, but here's what I'd say. There are early cases, very early, of Europeans calling native people of southeastern Massachusetts Wampanoags. It's clear early on in King Philip's War that the English widely refer to these people as Wampanoags. My sense is, and again, the historical record isn't substantive enough to answer this question. But much in the same way that people today will sometimes use Washington, D.C. as a euphemism for the United States, likewise, they did that for Pokanoket. Pokanoket, by the way, was the village where Pametacon lived, and thus was effectively the capital of the Wampanoags. How do Wampanoags consider the term First Peoples used in the Northwest? That's a good question. I'm not sure. First Nations is the term that Canada as a nation has set upon to refer to Indigenous peoples. Canada, in an act that I think would be impossible in the United States, actually had a national conversation about this issue of terminology and had native people from any one of a variety of backgrounds participate in it. And thus, you don't use the term Indians in Canada any longer. Is it true the trial and execution of the 3 natives by Plymouth colony officials went against the original treaty between Massasoit, Ousamequin, and the Pilgrims? There too, it's hard to say, and let me emphasize why. I don't know what Ousamequin thought that treaty was about. I know what the English wrote down, but I don't know what Ousamequin thought that treaty was about, other than it was a pledge for mutual defense and trade. There is a clause in that written version of the treaty, which the English record to send back to their sponsors in London. So, they have an audience in mind when they're crafting this document. What the treaty says is that if Wampanoags commit crimes against the English, they will turn over their own people to English justice. There is no conceivable way that Ousamequin agreed to such a provision, or that if he did, he ever intended to honor it. How do I know this? Well, for one, let's just consider the basic dynamic here. There was only 50 Plymouth colonists, 50 of them. They're surrounded by thousands of Wampanoag people. So why would the people whose homeland it is, in whom the English are guests, agree to turn over their own people to the newcomers' justice? Well, we also know they never did it, not for 50 plus years. And when the English tried to force the issue more than 50 years later, it produced a war. So that strongly suggests that the Wampanoags did not agree to any such thing. And I must point out, throughout, there are lots of reasons for wars between colonies and native people. Landed encroachment, murder, and the like. But usually the spark that lights that tinder, it's just disproportionately the spark that lights that tinder is when colonial authorities try to seize native people and subject them to colonial justice. Native people just will not tolerate outsiders exercising the right to determine the life and limb of their own people in their own country. Why did Pametacon come to be called King Philip? Well, the English have this pattern of giving native people names that are easier for them to pronounce all the time. And so when you read the record, you'll encounter Indian John over and over again, or Indian Sam, or Indian Elizabeth, or what have you. But in this particular case, when Ousamequin died, Pametacom and Wamsutta went to Plymouth and said to the English, "We want you to give us new names." And this is a rather complicated point, so I'll try to keep it short. Native people had this way when they were warning that they were considering war, of going to the people whom they were issuing that warning against and asking them for a gift of one sort or another that they would then use to war against that people. And I suspect that's what's going on here, that this is a warning that they're considering hostilities against Plymouth for its many crimes against them. Okay, let's see what else we have here. So yeah, there's a point that Lincoln declared a day of Thanksgiving, and how does this proclamation fit into our cultural narrative? Right. So Thanksgiving was a regional holiday, a New England holiday, into the 19th century. But then during the Civil War, when, of course, the North controlled the government, Lincoln proclaimed a national Thanksgiving to try to unify the country amid the horrors of the Civil War. And how Thanksgiving then spreads to become a national holiday is really interesting. I think the myth is part of it. To be sure, the myth was useful not only in the Northeast, but it was useful in the South, again, for papering over the crimes of the colonial period against indigenous people, among others. How can land acknowledgement statements recognize this history? Or how can institutions in this state and beyond more broadly acknowledge the Thanksgiving myth as problematic? I think those are two different things. And, what I will say is this: I understand and support the moral impulse behind land acknowledgements. The historian in me is deeply uncomfortable with them. And I'll tell you why. Because I think it has the unintentional effect of making it seem like Native history was frozen until Europeans arrived, when in fact it was dynamic. And so, the Wampanoags were there when the English arrived, but I don't know the identity of these people. Even if it was the same people, I don't know how they self-identified 2 centuries prior or 4 centuries prior. And I think very, very often, that notion of Native people frozen in time or as stewards of the land can lend itself to a kind of noble savagism, an idea that America was a pristine Eden frozen in time until Europeans came and ruined it. As a historian of Native people, I'm in favor of depicting them as dynamic and in 3-dimensional form. But again, I do very much understand the impulse behind land acknowledgements and support that impulse. As for challenging the Thanksgiving myth, well, we could stop having kids act in these Thanksgiving pageants. That would be a great place to start. And, look, let me be clear about what I'm suggesting here. I'm not declaring war on Thanksgiving. I'm not calling for a cancellation of Thanksgiving. I'm not trying to make white people feel guilty. What I'm suggesting is that the Thanksgiving myth is a lie, and that there's no reason why we need to attach that lie to a lovely ritual of getting together with family and friends and offering thanks for what's good in our lives. I'd point out, for more than 2 centuries, white New Englanders celebrated Thanksgiving without invoking pilgrims and Indians. I would also emphasize this: the job of a history education is not to make people feel patriotic or unpatriotic. The job of a history education is to allow people to see a complex past in all of its complexity, so we can better turn a critical lens to our own times and our own future. And so let's get rid of this myth and relegate it to the dustbin of 19th and 20th century cultural history. It has no use, no productive use in our multiracial, pluralistic democracy. Let's see what else we have here. How will you spend your Thanksgiving this year? Gorging myself and eating particularly eating as much pie as I possibly can. Okay, am I familiar with the Ohio bill with 227, which would ban the discussion of divisive topics in the public schools, prohibit topics that indicate that any race, gender have been responsible for discrimination? You're right. Such bills are historical nonsense. You cannot teach American history as a feel-good patriotic epic of white heroism. It's false. Students know it's false. They also find it deeply boring, and not just a lie, but boring. And then are resentful towards their authority figures when they get older and realize that they've been fed this lie. Look, grown-ups can handle this stuff, right? If they have a basic level of maturity. Do you really want your patriotism to be based on a falsehood? Or do you want your patriotism to come out of a real knowledge of what our past was about? I would also contend that what these bills are about, they're certainly not about history. What they're about is trying to quash any attempts for reform of historic injustices that continue to play out in the now. So let's understand what they're all about. You cannot understand American history without the teaching of race. It's fundamental to how our history unfolded. So fight against these bills. They are utterly wrongheaded. Let me see if there's anything else here. Do I have any recommendations for telling younger children the history or books that are age appropriate for them? Let's be clear. I teach college. I'm not a childhood education expert, but I've talked about this issue with Wampanoag people who know a thing or two about it, and their contention is that this history is not appropriate for young people. So what I'm suggesting then is, Thanksgiving season, just don't teach them about pilgrims and Indians, because if you're not going to give them the straight story, you shouldn't be giving them any story. And look, this is the difficulty with teaching colonial history to young people. Colonialism was, and for that matter, is fundamentally a bloody business. And in the North American context, the two main features of colonialism are Indian warfare, colonial Indian warfare, and slavery. You can't address the topic of colonial America without addressing those themes. They're not peripheral, they're central. And so, let's not feed our children a lie. They will come to resent it. See if there's anything else in here. Yeah, one last thing. So someone asked, well, how do you celebrate Thanksgiving? I like most of the rest of you. And by the way, like many Wampanoags, which is to say I get together with family and friends. We enjoy each other's company, ruminate a bit on the blessings in our lives. I think very few people recite a history of pilgrims and Indians, right? It's not at the dinner table where this sort of thing takes place. It's in the schools. It's in decorations that people put up in public. It's on radio and other forms of media. And so it would be fairly simple to eliminate this myth from this wonderful tradition. And that's what I would prefer to see happen. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in here and for your great questions and attention. If there's any follow-up, I can be reached at my email at djsilver@gwu.edu. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. It was a fascinating talk. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Happy
Good night.
Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.